Above the gorge, where the mountain river Osh rushed into milky foam, there was a special, primeval silence that Ivan Andreevich Belov, 48 years old, valued more than anything else in the world. He lay on the warm granite covered with branches of dwarf cedar and watched, his eyesight, honed by years of work in the Sayan Nature Reserve, allowed him to distinguish movement at a distance of half a kilometer. A young Siberian lynx was teaching two kittens to hunt capercaillie. It was not just a spectacle, but a lesson. Every movement, every breath of the predator told a story, leaving no doubt about the law and order of this world. There was no room for lies here, only hunger, instinct, and an honest, understandable end. His West Siberian Laika, Shadow, lay motionless nearby, a gray spot on a gray rock, blending in with the surrounding world as perfectly as her owner. Their coexistence was a symphony of silence. This idyll, built on the 1,000-year-old laws of the taiga, was shattered by a sound that was completely alien and hostile. The satellite phone, which Raven never kept with him but always took with him to the taiga, rattled in its canvas case, emitting a high-pitched, insistent signal like the buzzing of a trapped fly. Raven flinched, not with his body, but only with his gaze. He disliked this connection, considering it a thin, deceitful thread connecting him to a world he despised. A world that had spat him out 3 years ago when, as the city folk would say, he had crossed the line with someone too influential. He could have stayed here forever, but people were drowning in the forest all the time, and his inner code demanded that he answer the call. Slowly, as if reluctantly, he took out his device. His sinewy fingers, covered with a network of scars and wrinkles, pressed the receive button, and the silence was broken by the creaky, familiar voice of Police Captain Gromov, who had been assigned to the district department from the distant regional center. Gromov always sounded as if he had already lost, but Voron could sense his fatigue from a distance. "Ivan Andreevich, where are you?" Gromov asked without greeting him, getting straight to the point, as always when all other options had been exhausted. "Where you won't find me. Speak." "Don't waste your battery," Voron replied hoarsely, his voice low and raspy, like a stone worn smooth by the wind. "The case. It's not yours, Voron. Not mushroom pickers. Not a hunter. It's pure work. In the 17th Grove. Remember the village where the cell tower broke down 5 years ago and no one fixed it? Raven remembered. It was a place that had fallen off the digital map, a corner where time flowed according to the old solar calendar. The perfect hideout, the perfect place for a crime that should leave no traces. What's there? A programmer, a woman, Anna Svechina. She was working on a project, a secret one. She disappeared. Less than a week after she arrived, she buried herself in that village like it was a bunker. They were supposed to pick up her report yesterday, but the house is empty. No struggle, no noise. The neighbors, old people, didn't see anything. We dug everything up. The lab came, but there's only one piece of evidence, you understand? Only one. And it's breaking us. Gromov's voice sounded openly helpless, something he always tried to hide behind his bureaucratic mask. It was the helplessness that any city dweller feels when their tool, their gadget, stops working. A trace, Voron clarified, already knowing that it would be something out of this world, something that would violate the laws of the forest in the most unexpected way. A strip, 500 meters from the house, through the moss, through the undergrowth, perfectly even, thin, as if a knife had been drawn across it. It leads nowhere and starts nowhere, except from nowhere, as if it had been drawn. Experts say it's a drone, a heavy one. It flew low, or landed, and took off. And that's it. Not a hair, not a fingerprint, not even a trace of tires. Digital camouflage, damn it. Gromov exhaled a curse into the phone, which Voron could barely hear. You come to me when the trail goes off the road. But here it went off the ground. Into the air, Voron said quietly, his voice without reproach or mockery. Just a statement of fact. Because I know that a machine can never replace a living person. This isn't just a trail, Ivan Andreevich. It's a gap. A stupid gap. And if anyone will see it, it's you. You see where a person stopped being a person. That's your strength. You're not looking for traces. You're looking for a mistake, a human mistake, that always remains in the forest. Please, Raven, I need you to restore order. At that moment, Gromov was speaking as a private individual, as a man who was afraid, not of solving the crime, but of realizing that there was a force against which he was powerless. All right, I don't want the taiga to turn into a playground for your capital city toys. I'll come. But listen carefully. Raven spoke slowly, measuring each word like a grain of gold. My conditions. No helicopters within 5 kilometers of the village. No forensic experts, except for the one I need for measurements. No fuss. I will not work with you. I'll work with the taiga. You give me all the information about the programmer, her habits, what she ate, how she slept, whether she smoked or drank. I need her life to find her absence. Gromov, as if sensing that Raven had already agreed, nodded quickly and with relief on the other end of the line. Okay, I'll get everything ready. I'll be waiting for you in... how long? Tomorrow, before noon. Now hang up. You're disrupting my ecosystem. Voron ended the conversation without saying goodbye. Pressed the button and put the phone back in its case. He immediately began to get ready. His consultation on finding the lost tourists was over, and he had already determined their location, based on the behavior of blind owls and the unusual arrangement of fallen branches, indicating a disorderly, panicked march. Now he was in for a real hunt. He checked his old hunting knife, its blade gleaming with a dull but reliable light. His binoculars, tested by wind and years, took their place. Dry rations, a compass, matches, and most importantly, the right attitude. He felt that same incredibly attentive, heavy gaze, like that of a bird of prey, for which he was nicknamed Raven, come alive inside him. The case was urban, digital, coming from the depths of complex technologies alien to him. The kidnapping of a woman, working on a secret project, drones, perfectly camouflaged operations. All this contrasted disgustingly with his world, where crime always left traces of sweat, blood, fear, and broken branches. But Raven was sure, if a machine could be perfect, then the person who created and controlled it could not. Somewhere in this perfect plan, there had to be a crack, a puncture caused by fatigue, haste, or simple distraction. He didn't need digital prints or satellite images. He needed what no technology could hide: the criminal's breath, his fear, his haste, captured in the analog world, on the moss, on the ground, in the smell. He whistled. The shadow rose, and without making a sound, stood beside him, its eyes shining with obedience and impatience. They moved off. The raven descended from the granite ledge, its strong, sinewy legs seemingly leaving no traces, even on the soft ground. He was leaving the idyllic order of his world to find and restore order in a foreign, imported chaos. He was about to clash the laws of the forest with the laws of the metropolis. And he knew who would win. Through the thick pine trees that blocked the sun, he sensed the scent of a strange, disturbing mystery. He followed that scent. The road to the 17th Grove took Raven almost a day of walking, which by his standards was considered an easy stroll. He did not rush himself, but walked at a pace that allowed him to observe. The shadow walked ahead, like a gray shadow, which is why it got its nickname, and only the tip of its tail trembled with tension. The village, nestled on the bank of an overgrown ravine, looked not just isolated, but forgotten, as if its inhabitants had voluntarily signed an act of disappearance from civilization. Here, there was no hum of electricity hanging over the wires, no trills of cell phones interrupting the silence, and the air was heavy, infused with the smell of damp moss, cedar resin, and old, unburned wood. It was the perfect place for a secret project and, as a result, the perfect place for a crime, where digital camouflage was needed only to hide the preparation, but not the fact itself. The hook that Gromov had cast yesterday had worked. Voron had always been interested in the clash between the order of his world and the chaos brought about by people trying to cheat that order. Here, chaos had brought with it the tall, intrusive, hostile glare of urban technology. Near one of the crooked houses, distinguished by its fresh metal door, stood two government police cars, covered with a thin layer of red roadside dust. A small but irritated group of people bustled around them, their clothes too clean and their movements too sharp for this slow, sleepy neighborhood. It was this bustle, this nervous energy that Raven stumbled upon, that was the first clue. These people knew they had lost the battle with a place that did not want to accept their tools. Raven and Shadow did not notice him immediately. He stopped 50 meters from the house, allowing Gromov to see him first. The captain, a man of about 45, his face puffy from lack of sleep and paperwork, immediately stopped arguing with a thin man in a light gray suit, who clearly represented some kind of head organization. Gromov was a pitiful sight. He was a man of a system that had been abolished by the taiga. And when he saw Voron, his eyes expressed a mixture of relief and deep, almost animalistic shame. He approached Voron without extending his hand. "I've made arrangements. There won't be any helicopters. One forensic expert, the one who uses old methods, not electronics. His name is Oleg." "He's already here, and he knows his job," Gromov said quietly, muffled, as if afraid to break the silence, which seemed to be a living entity here. "Why all the fuss?" Voron nodded toward the house. "They're destroying what they could have left me." "You can't be nervous in the taiga. The taiga remembers every movement, especially useless ones. They're looking for a signal, looking for files, traces in the cloud, anything. They don't believe that a person could disappear like that, without a single trace in the digital world. It drives them crazy that their gadgets, their programs are useless here. That their world died the moment Anna Svechina crossed this threshold." Gromov looked at Voron with sincere, genuine envy. He envied the simplicity of his world, where a knife and binoculars were enough to search for the truth, rather than multi-million-dollar equipment. The house of the kidnapped Anna Svechina was a striking contrast. From the outside, it was an ordinary, darkened hut, like thousands of others in these parts. Inside, it was a sterile, almost laboratory-like space. The walls were covered with light-colored panels. The floor was covered with perfectly clean linoleum, and in the center of the room stood a stainless steel workbench. It was a refuge, a bunker, but not from the enemy, but from the world. Voron entered, and his eyes immediately began to read information that was inaccessible to the police. The police were looking for signs of a struggle, broken furniture, bloodstains, fingerprints. There was nothing. Raven was looking for traces of a life that had been suddenly cut short. There was a cup on the table with the remains of barely cooled herbal tea. Raven leaned over. There was no residue from long use on the bottom of the cup. Anna Svechina had been here recently. An open book lay nearby. Not a technical manual, but an old Russian novel about honor and war. Voron noticed a dog-eared page. She didn't finish reading it, he whispered to himself. She left suddenly, or they took her so quickly that she couldn't resist. It wasn't just a lack of struggle. It was proof of the highest professionalism. No rush, no panic. The criminals knew what they were doing and how to act in conditions of complete isolation. They didn't break down the door. They didn't smash the windows. They took her away, like they would take away valuable, fragile cargo. They neutralized her before she had time to scream, before she could instinctively grab a cup or drop a book. It was this perfect cleanliness that was the most telling clue. Voron walked around the table. The equipment Anna had been working on had obviously been taken away. Only the system unit remained, completely wiped clean of data, as if it had just been assembled. But Raven wasn't interested in clean technology. His attention was drawn to the corner of the table, where a small, almost invisible, translucent piece of tape had been stuck to the steel surface, torn off carelessly with a sharp movement. Underneath it, on the matte steel, there was a barely noticeable greasy mark that could only have come from a human hand, sweaty from nervous tension or fatigue. It was a mark that the forensic experts had missed, because it wasn't a fingerprint. It was a mark of a state of mind. Gromov, standing in the doorway, silently watched as Voron studied the dead page of the novel. He handed Voron a thick bound document in a hard folder, Anna Svechina's personal file, which included not only the dry facts of her biography, but also excerpts from conversations with her colleagues about her habits, her routine, her life, which Voron wanted to find in order to discover her absence. Your file. Everything I could get from the city. It's about her life, about her obsession with this project. She was, as they say, obsessed with the truth. No one knew her, and no one understood what she was doing, Gromov said quietly. Voron took the folder, feeling the weight of a life that was foreign and incomprehensible to him. He opened the folder to the first page and saw her photo. A young woman with a very serious, piercing gaze that seemed to see through walls. He felt a strange, respectful sympathy for her. She too was obsessed with order, but only digital order, and now that order had been stolen. Voron closed the folder. There was nothing left for him to do in the house. The only living trace awaited him outside, in the world of moss and stone. I need Oleg, your forensic scientist. Have him bring equipment for measuring moisture and weight.
I'm going after the trail, said Raven, his quiet voice sounding like a verdict in the sterile silence of the house. He left the house without looking at the police officers, who continued to search for non-existent digital evidence.
The shadow waited for him, turning its muzzle toward the forest, which smelled of alarm and a strange, artificial cleanliness. Voron walked toward the perfect strip on the moss, toward his main opponent, the car driven by the man who had made the mistake, following the scent of that very mistake. The Raven walked ahead, not slowing down, not looking at his feet, but never once stumbling over the roots hidden under the rotten leaves. Behind him, trudging heavily, followed Oleg, the criminalist. Oleg was young but not stupid, and his respect for Raven was based not on his nickname or legends, but on Gromov's reports. Raven was never wrong when it came to the tiger. Oleg carried a heavy but neat case, with equipment not intended for digital data analysis. A measuring device, a gravimeter, and a kit for taking soil and moisture samples. It was a museum piece compared to the technology available in the capital, but it was this, not scanners, that Voron needed now. They walked exactly half a kilometer away from the village, and the forest, untouched by human intervention, began to breathe deeply. Oleg was breathing heavily, trying to keep up with the former inspector's light, almost gliding gait. There is no road here, Ivan Andreevich. Absolutely none. Even animal trails are rare here. Why did they choose this place for takeoff? Oleg asked, stopping to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Voron did not answer immediately. He raised his hand, and the shadow walking 10 steps ahead of them froze, becoming part of the forest texture. The Raven looked back, and his heavy, attentive gaze slid over the tops of the pines, over the patches of lichen on the trunks, and finally settled on the ground. Because the forest here is invisible. There are no witnesses here, no network, not even hunters. Here, communication dies. And a drone leaves no traces. It doesn't need a road. It is an extension of will, but not of physics. His voice was quiet, like the rustle of a dry leaf. The Raven looked at the forest as if it were a complex mathematical formula, and his eyes revealed an equation that had not yet been solved. And then they saw it. The clue was exactly as Gromov had described, offensively perfect, alien, as if someone had run a surgical scalpel across the green body of moss. The strip, no more than 15 centimeters wide, stretched for exactly 20 meters, before ending at a small hill. It was not a torn trail, not a crushed imprint, but a perfectly even, flat depression, where the green bumpy moss had been flattened, but not torn, its fibers lying in one direction, as if they had been smoothed with a heavy, hot iron. Oleg crouched down, mechanically taking out his camera, but Voron stopped him, shaking his head. The camera sees what it is shown. It won't see what is hidden behind the perfect shape. Every police force in the world will be looking for the drone's digital code. I'll be looking for its weight, said Voron, his gaze fixed, not on the strip, but on what lay beneath it. He took a small piece of thin but strong wire, bent into the shape of the letter G, out of his belt bag, and began to carefully, almost with surgical precision, measure the depth of the moss indentation. Oleg, despite his modern education, looked at this analog method with awe. Here, 3 millimeters, and here, at the edge, 4.5. A perfect strip. But the pressure is uneven. This means that the drone was heavily loaded, but the load was not static. It shifted during takeoff. This isn't just a box. It's a living cargo and equipment, Voron said, not to Oleg, but to himself. piecing together the picture like a mosaic from fragments.
He asked Oleg to measure the soil moisture at 3 points, inside the strip, just behind it, and on an untouched area of moss.
Oleg quickly and professionally completed the task, and the results surprised him. The moisture inside the strip was significantly lower than in the surrounding areas, but not because it had dried out, but because all the moisture had been squeezed out during the crush. Voron thoughtfully crouched down, touching the flattened moss with his fingertips. The moisture has been squeezed out, but it hasn't had time to return.
This means that the takeoff was no more than a day ago, and, more importantly, it was early in the morning. At this time, the humidity is highest and the soil is most pliable.
But at the same time, the drone was powerful enough to create such a smooth trail. They knew what they were doing. They calculated everything. The weight of the drone, its power, the time, the soil moisture. This is not an airplane taking off from a runway. This is a perfectly planned operation. There was no anger in his voice, only a cold, philosophical acknowledgement of the enemy's strength. He came to a calculation of weight based on the density of the moss, the level of compression, and the moisture content of the soil. Voron calculated that the total weight of the taking-off aircraft with its cargo was at least 90 kilograms. The woman, Anna Svechina, weighs no more than 60. So 30 kilograms is the equipment. Suitcases with equipment, spare batteries, possibly a generator. This is not just a kidnapping. This is theft of a secret that needs to be extracted, and it requires the transportation of very specific, heavy instruments. Equipment that is not afraid of the tiger, but needs privacy. Voron stood up, his eyes narrowing like a bird that had spotted its prey. His gaze slid over the perfect trail again. It was a trap for the mind. The criminals knew that the police, especially those accustomed to digital evidence, would stop at this strip. They would scan it, photograph it, discuss drone models. They would allow themselves to be distracted by the perfect work of the machine. But Voron was looking for human error. Perfection is always a mask. He moved 3 meters away from the strip, to where the moss was completely untouched. The machine is perfect. But who launched it? A human. And that human cannot be a machine. He had to stand here to control the takeoff. A heavy drone requires attention and strength. The person was tense. He stood here so as not to be noticed, and he had to control the process. And here, on the border between the perfect work of the machine and the nervous tension of the person, there must be a mistake. Raven whispered. He crouched at the very edge of the strip, where the ground transitioned from pristine to trampled. Raven wasn't looking for a footprint that would show the direction of movement. He was looking for a footprint of condition. He ran his hand over the grass, barely touching it, and his gaze stopped at a barely noticeable, almost invisible shift in the soil. It was not a complete imprint, but rather a small, millimeter-sized displacement of the turf made by the heel of a boot. The person standing here was not standing perfectly still. He was a little tired or distracted, or, most importantly, he was holding something heavy that required balance. He made a small, instinctive step to regain his balance. This trace was smaller than the shadow's traces, but it was there. It wasn't the footprint of the kidnapper. It was the footprint of the operator controlling the machine. It was the first analog puncture in their digital camouflage. Raven smiled an internal, cold smile. He had found where the power of the machine ended and human unreliability began. The shift in the soil at the edge of the perfect strip was not just a footprint. For Raven, it was a handwritten word, carelessly inserted by a human into a typewritten, flawless text. He knelt, his nose almost touching the ground, his heavy, incredibly attentive gaze piercing the thickness of the turf. The shadow, having received a silent command, lay 2 meters away, completely motionless, its muzzle lowered to its paws. Leica sensed her master's tension, understanding that this millimeter-long mistake held the key to their future path. It was not the footprint of a fugitive or a pursuer. It was the footprint of a man who stood in his place, controlling the process, but for a moment lost perfect control of his own body. Oleg, standing over him with a measuring device, also saw this indentation, a barely noticeable bump where the ground was raised and slightly shifted rather than pressed down, as on the strip. There is no complete imprint here, only lateral pressure. It's as if the man was keeping his balance, the forensic scientist said quietly, trying to speak as slowly as Voron. Exactly. He was keeping his balance. He stood on one leg slightly longer than the other. His weight was unevenly distributed because he was either tired, distracted, or, most likely, holding something heavy in his hands that required constant balance correction. He stood here for no more than a minute, leaving no shadow on the moss, leaving no complete footprints, but his body, his fatigue, his nervous tension left this. A human echo, Raven said in a low, hoarse voice without raising his head, continuing to feel the edge of the footprint with his fingertips. He began to reconstruct the scene, using survival psychology and knowledge of the human body. If a person stood here, controlling the takeoff of a heavy drone, then he needed direct visual contact with the device, as well as with the place from which the drone picked up its cargo. The body of the kidnapped Anna Svechina and her equipment. Based on the information provided by Gromov, Voron knew that the kidnapping took place early in the morning, before the first rays of the sun. This means that the drone operator was working in poor lighting conditions and under time pressure, as well as needing to remain completely silent. The drone picked up the cargo in the dark. The operator controlled it manually so as not to make a mistake, to perfectly cover his tracks. That requires attention. It requires concentration. And where there is concentration, there is fatigue. Voron stood up and turned around, his gaze like a laser, tracing a line from the sap to the place where the drone's perfect trail ended. He tracked the angle of vision that the operator needed. The line did not lead to the house, but slightly to the side, to dense bushes, where, apparently, the criminals were waiting for the perfect moment. The raven moved there. The shadow rose silently and followed him. Step by step, he read the book that nature had securely closed for everyone else. The perfect drone trail ended, but another trail began. A trail where it was no longer a machine at work, but an animal. A human being trying to hide his animal nature. For several meters, there was nothing in the thick grass but a chaotic tangle of stalks. But Raven noticed something that even the most experienced urban detective would have missed. He noticed asymmetry. Look, Oleg. Raven stopped. The grass. Here, it's flattened, but it's risen. But here, he pointed to a patch near an old, thick cedar tree. The grass is flattened, more, and not just flattened, but as if bent in one direction. The foot didn't just walk over it, it slid. Even though the person didn't fall, Oleg crouched down, his face expressing confusion. It's transportation. The person was walking backward, dragging something. Or someone. His center of gravity was shifted. He had to pull. But at the same time, make sure not to leave deep tracks that would indicate the weight of the load. He was walking backwards or sideways, dragging it behind him. And at some point, instinctively, he slipped with his heel, trying to keep his balance. This is the fatigue I'm looking for. Fatigue that makes the body react, not the mind. Voron ran his finger along the bent stems. He didn't see the criminal, but he saw his tense, focused back, his labored breathing in the morning dampness. Voron picked up the file on Anna Svechina that Gromov had given him. He didn't read it. He just weighed it in his hand. The woman weighs about 60 kilograms, plus 30 kilograms of equipment. 90 kilograms. That's too much for one person to transport so far and unnoticed, even if she was under the influence of a sleeping pill. So there were two of them, or three, working in shifts. Raven's logic was simple and uncompromising, based on the physics of the forest rather than human laws. He began to follow the faint traces of grass sliding away from the perfectly clean house and the perfect drone strip. These tracks were almost invisible, but they were there, like the faint but sure pulse of a crime. They did not point to the drone, but to the place where the criminals first stopped to rest or regroup before their cargo became digital. Voron knew that this path would not be long. A tired man carrying a heavy load will not go far. His first desire will be to stop, drop the load, and catch his breath. It was at this moment, when they first felt safe, that they made their next, inevitable, mistake. The trail of skid marks ended at a thick wall of young spruce trees. Raven and Shadow stopped. This is where they dropped their load, the candle and the equipment. For a short time, they went ahead to look around or to signal the drone, and they cleaned up after themselves. They thought they had taken everything, but the body of a human, even the most trained, always leaves a trace. Raven whispered, peering into the spruce forest. He wasn't looking for a discarded cigarette butt or a piece of clothing. He was looking for a violation of the natural order. The shadow finally got her command. Raven nodded to her, almost imperceptibly. Leica, as if dissolving into the grass, glided forward, using her instincts and nose. She wasn't looking for a person. She was looking for a foreign scent. A minute later, she let out a barely audible, tense sigh and stopped at the foot of an old, thick cedar tree, its trunk covered with moss and lichen. The raven approached. In this spot, the moss was not trampled, but disturbed. It was as if someone had quickly and carelessly torn it away to hide something. The raven crouched down, his eyes flashing with that cold, predatory gleam that always appeared when he felt he was getting close to the truth. He found not a hidden object, but a trace of an object. At the very bottom of the moss, in a depression made by something square and heavy, there was a faint imprint of thick rubber, similar to the bottom of an industrial suitcase, and most importantly, next to this imprint, on the lichen, there was a thin, almost invisible line, as if someone had run a knife blade over it to check if the object was hidden deep enough. It was a sign of nervousness. It was the criminal's signature. Voron knew that this slip-up was not only due to fatigue, but also to haste. He had found a thin thread leading from the perfect digital world to the world of human weaknesses, which he knew by heart. The thin, barely discernible line left by the nervous tip of the knife on the lichen and the imprint of the rubber bottom of the suitcase were the last words spoken by the secret at the resting place. Standing at the edge of the spruce forest, Raven immediately stopped looking for traces on the ground. The ground was too unreliable a witness. Now he began to read the forest itself, turning into an instrument for measuring human emotional and physical overload. The imprint of the suitcase and the slide of the drone operator's heel were his starting points. There were at least two of them. The Raven whispered to Oleg, who was looking at the clues he had found with almost religious awe. 90 kilograms. They had to be transported from Svetina's house, here, in the dark, across rough terrain where there are no trails. That's at least 500 meters. The person carrying this weight wasn't thinking about footprints. He was thinking about the pain in his back, about the next step, about how to get rid of the load. Professionalism ended when physics began, and it was physics that caused them to make two mistakes. First, the jump when launching the drone, and then carelessness during the stop. Voron closed his eyes. He didn't try to imagine what the criminals were doing. He tried to feel what they were feeling. The cold of the early morning, the heavy load, the nervous tension from the crime they had committed. Professionals who rely on technology always make the biggest mistake when their technology fails, or when they are forced to rely on their bodies. The taiga does not forgive fatigue. Fatigue always leads to a decrease in attention, a miscalculation of strength, and involuntary movements. He began to move in the direction indicated by the suitcase's trail, but not on the ground, but on the upper tier of the forest. His gaze, clinging to branches, lichens, and even cobwebs, searched for a second, more important place to rest. The first was too close to the village, to the risk zone. The second had to be further away, in an area they considered completely safe, where they could relax, perhaps have a snack, check their equipment, or, most importantly, talk in full voice for the first time, removing their masks. When a criminal counting on a quick operation is faced with the need to carry heavy cargo, he begins to rush to compensate for his physical weakness. They couldn't have gone far, Voron reasoned, addressing Oleg, who just followed him silently, trying to remember every word. They were heading north, toward the old logging sites. Why there? Because there is old, forgotten infrastructure there. There are places to hide, places to leave large objects that are foreign to the taiga. They had to go to the first reliable point capable of accommodating 90 kilograms of cargo and 2 or 3 people without the risk of being spotted by a random hunter. They walked for about an hour, and Voron did not find a single footprint or hear a single crack of a branch, except for those made by Oleg himself. The criminals were apparently dressed in high-quality silent suits, and their steps were calculated to have minimal impact. They were undoubtedly trained. They were machines, but machines with a limited range of motion, and that range was always limited. Voron was looking for the moment when the machine first felt like a human being. Suddenly, Raven stopped. His gaze was fixed on the trunk of an old, broken birch tree. On its bark, at about shoulder height, there was a tiny, almost invisible streak of dust. It was not fresh, but not old either, and was located as if something had quickly brushed against it with a shoulder or the edge of a backpack. Raven immediately smelled something. Not the smell of pine needles or mushrooms, but a subtle, pungent, almost elusive aroma that the taiga never produces. The smell of ozone and synthetics. They carried something very large here, said Raven, sniffing the bark like a dog.
And they didn't just carry it, they brushed against it in a hurry. This is no longer fatigue. It's haste caused by fear. Fear that they might be seen. They know their perfect plan has cracked, and they're rushing to their next base, to their refuge. Oleg cautiously approached and took a sample of the dust rubbed off the birch bark. It looks like fine technical dust, Ivan Andreevich. Maybe from optics or some kind of complex circuit board. I don't know what it is. His voice sounded uncertain. It's the smell of the city, Oleg. The smell of sterility and clean laboratories. They brought an alien world here, and that world leaves its mark. This smell is here because they left it behind in their nervous haste, Voron said, with quiet, philosophical certainty. He knew that this smell was not just a chemical compound. It was the imprint of a foreign, hostile ecosystem. Voron raised his head. The forest in front of them began to change. The pine trees became sparser, and underfoot appeared traces of old, moss-covered log roads that had been used for logging in the last century. This was an area where human activity, albeit old, had left behind infrastructure. Abandoned warehouses, cabins, old roads that could be quickly traversed on foot or by all-terrain vehicle, bypassing all the main highways. This was what he was looking for, a zone of temporary safety, where criminals could catch their breath. Strangely enough, the tracks here, on the old road, were even less noticeable than in the dense forest. But Voron knew that the moss on old logs was different. It was looser, more sensitive to pressure. And he found it. A barely noticeable, almost perfect indentation on the corner of one of the logs. It wasn't a shoe print. It was a knee print. A rest stop, Raven stated. They stopped here, tired. They dropped their load, and one of them dropped to one knee. Not to rest, but for a quick inspection, or to check their equipment, or to drink some water. He left a mark from his knee, not his soul. This suggests that he is a professional who knows how to leave a minimum of traces. But he forgot about the moss. Voron knelt down at this spot. He closed his eyes again. The knee that had flattened the moss left no trace of dirt. It was clean. This meant that the clothing was new or had just been cleaned. Again, the smell of synthetics. And most importantly, Raven found a barely noticeable dent on one of the old, half-rotten logs lying off the main road. The dent was tiny, perfectly round, as if it had been left by a narrow metal object. A tripod, or a support for a rangefinder, or for a drone control device. They weren't just resting here. They were setting up equipment to survey the road, to figure out where to go next. They didn't want to make another mistake. They consulted with the machine, trying to shift the responsibility onto it. Voron raised his head, and his gaze was directed precisely north. Now he had not just a trail, but a psychological portrait of the kidnappers. They were professionals, obsessed with the perfect plan and the cleanliness of the operation. They relied on technology, but their bodies and nerves let them down. They were on the run, frightened by their own mistake, which they had left behind in the form of a blunder, and were eager to get to a place where they could regain their digital control as quickly as possible. And that place, according to Raven's logic, had to be large, reliable, and most importantly, capable of serving as a base for storing the fragile and heavy equipment they were carrying with them to extract the
stolen secret. He found their moment of weakness, and weakness was the only thing that connected these people to his world. A world where even the most perfect lie leaves its mark on the earth. A knee mark and a knife mark as thin as a hair, left by a nervous hand on the lichen, led Raven and Shadow to abandoned logging sites. It was an area that the tiger had long since reclaimed, but where the ghostly echoes of human industry still lingered. Old, half-rotten logs, moss-covered tracks that had not been trodden on for decades. This place was not chosen by chance. It lay off the beaten track, but had a structure that allowed for quick movement and the concealment of large loads. For criminals seeking digital refuge, it was the ideal gray zone. The Raven walked slowly, with a leisurely, springy step, his eyes not looking at his feet, but scanning the surrounding space in 3 dimensions. He was not looking for footprints, but for a violation of the geometric integrity of the forest. The shadow moved slightly ahead, its nose working like a highly sensitive gas analyzer, unerringly separating the organic smells of decay and dampness from foreign, synthetic ones. After walking half a kilometer along an old log road, Raven stopped. A clearing. A small, enclosed area surrounded by dense fir trees, which had probably once served as a resting place for lumberjacks. A place perfectly sheltered from the wind and prying eyes. Camp was, Raven said in a low voice, his voice as hoarse as the creak of an unlubricated door hinge. Gromov, whom Raven had asked to stay 10 meters away and remain silent, saw nothing. The clearing looked completely untouched. Thick, even grass, a little moss, the usual forest debris. A perfect alibi, signed by nature itself. But for Raven, for whom the forest was a living book, it was a glaring, screaming violation. There was nothing here but emptiness. But that emptiness was too perfect. He walked to the center of the clearing. The shadow, having received tacit permission, began to slowly sniff the ground. She gave no obvious signal, but her tail, which usually held upright, dropped, and her movements became unnaturally cautious, as if she were walking on thin ice. Laika sensed what a human could not detect. A scent that had been there and was now gone. The Raven knelt down. He did not dig into the ground. His attention was drawn to a dead birch leaf lying on top of the damp turf. The leaf was dry and should have been light, easily moved by any breath of wind. However, it lay motionless, and its position was unnatural. The edge of the leaf was slightly curved, and in the center there was a shallow but clear break. It was crushed, Raven whispered. Crushed by a corner. The corner of something very heavy and square, and this object, before it was removed, pressed down on the leaf, leaving a mark that did not smooth out because the leaf was already dry. He carefully lifted the sheet with the tip of his hunting knife. Underneath was damp but completely clean soil. The criminals hadn't just cleared the camp, they had cleaned it down to the molecular level, sweeping away every piece of debris, and even loosening the soil to make it look untouched. They worked as if they were preparing for an inspection. Their goal was to completely destroy the analog trace left by their digital operation. This spoke to their high level of preparation and composure. They were waiting here for the drone, or waiting for a signal to launch it. The drone couldn't fly that far. It had to be prepared here or received here. This angle, it's too sharp. It's not a backpack, not a box. It's something industrial. Maybe a container for the drone or its batteries, Voron said, his eyes fixed on the break in the leaf. That dead, dry leaf was the only honest witness in this clearing. He began to move slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, his hands, rough and sinewy, working like locators, feeling the grass and the bases of the trees. And then, near an old, almost rotten stump, Voron again sensed an alien presence, not with his eyes, but with his nose. The shadow froze, its nostrils quivering slightly. It was a smell. Subtle, pungent, almost imperceptible, but so sharp and inorganic that it cut through the natural scent of the forest. The smell of machine oil, not ordinary industrial oil that might have been left behind by old logging equipment, but light, synthetic, expensive oil for high-precision mechanisms. There it is. Raven pointed to a stump on which the criminals had apparently leaned something bulky. At the edge of the stump, in one of the depressions where a drop could have dripped, he found a tiny, almost microscopic spot. It was dark and dense. Oil, lubricant, fresh, and not ours. This isn't what you use to lubricate chainsaws. This is grease for bearings, for high-precision gears. This is the smell of something they brought from the city, from a clean workshop. Raven ran his finger over the spot and brought it to his nose. He smelled not only oil, but also a faint hint of chemicals similar to a cleaning solvent. It was a double signature. The equipment itself had left a trace of oil, and the person who maintained it had left a trace of his excessive cleanliness. They kept the drone here, or at least its main, heavy parts, batteries, motors, anything that required lubrication and maintenance. The equipment was clean, but during transport, shaking, or assembly, a single drop fell. They wiped it off, but didn't notice this indentation in the stump. Too small a mistake to notice, but too big to hide from the tiger. Voron smiled, and that smile, running through the wrinkles on his weathered face, was cold and contemptuous. The smell told him more than any digital fingerprint. It told him about the nature of the criminals. They were fanatically cautious and relied on the fact that their digital trail was impossible to trace, and therefore paid less attention to the physical world. They were people of purity and high technology who did not notice how their machine, their flawless tool, left its invisible but caustic mark. Now that Raven knew what they were carrying, he knew what they needed. They needed not just a base, but a place where this sensitive equipment could be charged, tuned, and maintained. The camp was a phantom, perfectly erased. But the smell of machine oil was an anchor that tied this phantom to reality. Raven knew that his path was taking him further and further away from the village, deep into abandoned territory. The next clue would tell him about the criminals themselves, about their daily habits, which they had been unable to change even under conditions of strict secrecy. He stood up, his gaze heavy and calm, piercing the thicket. Human fatigue and carelessness had already given him 2 clues, and he was sure that very soon he would find their third, most personal, and most vulnerable mistake. The thin, acrid smell of synthetic machine oil that Raven had discovered on an old stump was not just a clue. It was an arrow pointing north. The criminals couldn't have gone far with heavy, sensitive equipment and a kidnapped person. Now that Raven understood their obsession with cleanliness and reliance on technology, he began to look not for the logic of their movements, but for moments when that obsession failed due to basic human needs: food, water, rest, and most importantly, that habit that cannot be changed even under threat of exposure. They passed abandoned logging sites, delving deeper into the wild, untouched part of the taiga, where old roads gave way to animal trails. Raven knew that here the criminals must have felt as safe as possible, believing that no one would be able to track them down. But it was here, far from civilization, that human weaknesses became most apparent. Voron walked along the edge of a shallow stream that meandered along their presumed route. Water is life, and even the most high-tech criminals need it. Shadow, having received tacit permission to search more actively, began to prowl along the bank. A few minutes later, the Leica gave a low, quiet growl, which was far more informative to Raven than any forensic report. She stood at a crevice between two large boulders, her nose pressed against the damp moss. Voron approached. In the hollow, where something small had apparently been deliberately thrown, lay two objects. The first was a crumpled energy bar wrapper. The second was a cigarette butt. Voron carefully extracted the butts from the crevice with the tip of his knife. It was not a cigarette, not a local hunter's homemade cigarette, but an expensive, neat cigarette with a high-quality filter. The cigarette butt itself was short, rounded, which indicated nervousness or habit. But more important than the cigarette itself was what was left on its filter. Voron brought the butt to his nose. He smelled not only tobacco, but also another sharp chemical aroma. It was the smell of disinfectant. Not the kind used in hospitals, but a milder one used in modern city offices or cleaning companies to treat hands and surfaces. It was the smell of the city that the criminals had tried to bring with them to the taiga. Hygiene. Excessive, Raven whispered. These aren't just city dwellers. These are people who live in sterile conditions. They must have treated their hands after touching the kidnapped woman or the equipment so as not to leave the slightest trace of DNA or smell. And even when they smoked, they couldn't get rid of that smell. Habit proved stronger than the need for camouflage. The energy bar confirmed his guess. It wasn't simple, rough food for a hike. The packaging was made of thin foil and bore an image of a bright, exotic, tropical fruit. The bar was designed for quick calorie replenishment, not long-lasting satiety. Haste and money. They don't have time for cooking or campfires. They need a quick, clean source of energy. These aren't taiga dwellers. These aren't people who will sit by the fire and relax. They are constantly on the move and constantly tense. And their nerves couldn't take it. They decided to stop here by the water, and one of them lit a cigarette while the other had a quick snack, not bothering to bury the trash deep, but simply throwing it into a crevice, thinking that no one would come here. The Raven understood that. Every detail like this was a microscopic hole in their digital camouflage. The criminals relied on their technology to leave no traces, and therefore were unable to control their simplest, most human impulses. Fatigue caused the drone operator to make a mistake, and nerves and habit caused him to leave behind a cigarette butt and wrapper. Now we know their psychological profile. 2, maybe 3. Professionals, obsessed with cleanliness and secrecy, relying on expensive, high-precision equipment. They are nervous. They are in a hurry. And they brought with them an entire arsenal of equipment that cannot walk in the field without a base. Voron said to himself, his eyes piercing the thicket. The base. That was the key now. Where could they have gone? For something secret. They needed not just a hiding place, but a secure, dry room, where they could store electronics, charge lots of batteries, and most importantly, where they could force the programmer to work in isolation. They needed a room with a solid floor, protection from moisture, and possibly some remaining utilities.
Voron checked the map in his head, a map consisting not of topographical symbols, but of memories of abandoned buildings, hunting lodges, and old geological and logging bases. We're on the old road leading to the pass.
A little further on, there's an abandoned hunting warehouse that used to belong to the timber industry. There's a log cabin there, a dry place, perfect for temporary storage of this kind of equipment. They didn't go any further so as not to carry the load for too long. The warehouse. Voron made his decision, and his gaze, as if fixed on the prize, became even heavier and calmer. He looked at Gromov, who was standing behind him, not daring to approach this dirty evidence, which was nothing more than trash to him. Oleg, you know what to do. This evidence stays here, untouched. Have your experts come here when I'm done. For now, forget about it. I'm going to the warehouse. They must have left their real analog footprint there. Traces of heavy cargo storage. A person can clean up trash, but they can't remove scratches from wood. Voron whistled to the shadows, and they moved on, now with confidence. The cigarette butts and the smell of disinfectant were the last traces of the world they had left behind. And these traces, paradoxically, led straight to the base, which was supposed to be the limit of their caution. Raven walked, feeling the tension mounting and the line between pure digital crime and dirty human error becoming thinner and thinner. The abandoned hunting lodge was exactly as Raven had imagined it. A low log cabin, built with care, but long since abandoned by humans. The roof was overgrown with moss. The windows were boarded up, and everything around it breathed decay and oblivion. It stood on a small, well-drained hillock, deep in an old clearing, which ensured natural dryness and seclusion. Ideal conditions for storing expensive electronics. It was a place that had disappeared from maps, but remained in the memory of the forest and those who knew how to read that memory. The Raven stopped 30 meters from the warehouse. The shadow lay down, merging with the undergrowth, and now worked not only with its nose, but also with its ears, picking up the slightest vibrations in the air. There were no guards. The criminals were confident in their digital invisibility, and that the analog traces left in the clearing would lead nowhere. They had either already left or were sitting inside, busy extracting secrets from the kidnapped programmer. Voron did not break down the door. He walked around the log cabin, looking for traces that the criminals might consider insignificant. From the outside, it looked as if no human had set foot here since the timber mill closed. But Voron was looking for subtle clues, not obvious ones. His gaze caught on the door jamb. There was a barely noticeable, fresh scratch on it, as if the tip of a knife had been run across the old wood. It was not a trace of vandalism or a bear. It was a clear, straight line that could have been left by something hard and angular that had been brought inside. He climbed over the low, rotten fence that once protected the warehouse from animals with ease and animalistic silence. Entering through a hole in the back wall, which he enlarged in a few seconds with a knife, Raven found himself inside. The dry, stale smell of old wood and dust hit his nose, but underneath it, faint but distinct, was the same synthetic scent he had already caught on the cigarette butt. A mixture of disinfectant and expensive artificial lubricant. Inside, it was dimly lit. The warehouse was empty, but the floor, a sturdy wooden plank that should have been covered with an even layer of dust, was scraped clean in places. And most importantly, there were scratches on it. There were many small, shallow, but distinct lines running across the boards. These were not marks left by rough boots or heavy logs. They were marks left by wheels. The wheels of industrial suitcases, the very ones used to transport fragile, expensive equipment. The scratches started at the door and led to the central, driest part of the warehouse where, judging by their concentration, the suitcases had been for the longest time. Voron knelt down and ran his hand across the floor. Under his fingers he felt a residue, barely noticeable, like pollen. There was a base here. For a short time, he thought. They brought drones and equipment here. They used suitcases with wheels, so they wouldn't have to carry heavy loads in their hands. People who are not used to physical labor and rely on mechanization. They thought that by removing the suitcases, they would erase all traces. But metal always leaves its mark on wood, which cannot be hidden by anything. He carefully examined the log walls. The warehouse was built of thick, chopped logs, and in one place, at waist level, he noticed an unusual stain. It was not a stain of dirt, but a mark of melted, translucent plastic that had stuck to the log and then been scraped off. Raven touched it. The plastic was hard, but there were traces of melting around the edges, as if something very hot had been pressed against the wood for a short time. A malfunction, Raven whispered. They were in a hurry, or too tired, or something went wrong. It's a trace of a battery, a high-capacity one, from a drone or a computer power supply. The battery overheated while charging or being transported, and they panicked, quickly throwing it away from other equipment to avoid a short circuit or fire. It was a careless, spontaneous act, caused by fear of losing control of the technology. The trail of melted plastic was the most important analog evidence of their humanity and vulnerability. The professionals, who had calculated everything, forgot that technology can malfunction, and that the human reaction to such a malfunction will always be animalistic. Panic, haste, the desire to quickly eliminate the threat. They quickly removed the battery and scraped off the plastic, but did not notice that even this small microscopic trace had been imprinted on the tree. The Raven began to piece together the picture. A group of 2 or 3 people obsessed with cleanliness and secrecy, but unable to cope with a sudden technical crisis. They drove to the nearest road, then walked to this warehouse where they stored their equipment, including a heavy drone. The abduction took place at night. They quickly took the woman to the drone's takeoff point, loaded her, and possibly some of the equipment onto it, and sent it off into the air. But where? The warehouse gave him the answer. On the wooden floor, closer to the back wall, where it was darkest, he found another clue. In a recess in the wood, where no light reached, lay an almost perfectly round, very thin metal washer, similar to a fastener. He picked it up. It was part of an antenna or satellite communication mount. The washer was made of an unusually light but durable alloy that did not rust. Communication. Raven clenched the washer in his fist. The warehouse was just a waypoint. They needed isolation to force the programmer to work, but they also needed a way to transmit the results. That means the final destination must be higher up, where there is the possibility of a stable satellite signal, or a place where the remains of old antennas and transmitting stations have been preserved. He went outside,
his eyes adjusting to the
light of the taiga again. The warehouse was only a temporary port for them, where the equipment could rest. Now they had to move on to the final destination. Understanding their psychology, the rush, fatigue, and need for reliable data transmission, Voron knew that his path lay only upward. Towards the mountain pass, where old meteorological or military stations once stood. These were places where man had tried to reach the sky and left behind iron that could now serve as their refuge. He felt that the tension had reached its peak and that he was moving towards them. All he had to do was find the final, fatal mistake they would make, relying on their digital toys. 3 analog clues, barely noticeable scratches from wheels on the floor, a trace of melted plastic on a log, and a thin light metal washer from a satellite dish, came together in Raven's mind to form a complete picture of the crime. The warehouse was a transshipment point, a place where complex, expensive equipment, as sensitive as greenhouse plants, could be quickly assembled, serviced, and prepared for the next, final stage. They brought with them not only a heavy drone, but also powerful batteries, high-performance computers, and satellite communication equipment. It was a mobile digital bunker, and despite the wheels on the suitcases, its weight was enormous. Voron, who had been carrying loads through the taiga since he was 20, could calculate this load with remarkable accuracy. Considering that there were at least 2, and most likely 3 people in the group, each carrying about 25 kilograms of personal belongings, weapons, and equipment, plus the weight of Anna Svechina herself, who was probably transported under the influence of sedatives or tied up, plus the weight of bulky equipment and suitcases. The total mass they had to move from the road to the warehouse was at least 300 kilograms. Moving such a load through unfamiliar, overgrown terrain, even over short distances, requires enormous physical effort and, more importantly, perfect synchronization. But they were moving at night, after a tense kidnapping operation, which in itself required maximum concentration and nervous tension. The battery failure, traces of which Raven found on the log, was a direct result of their fatigue and haste. They couldn't have gone far. The maximum distance from this warehouse to the final point where they planned to settle could not exceed 15 kilometers, and that was assuming the road was relatively flat. If the route went uphill into the mountains, the distance was halved. Raven chose the second option. Their need for communication and isolation outweighed the need for an easy route. He unfolded his old, well-worn map, which was stored in a waterproof case. This map marked not only official trails, but also abandoned sites known only to locals. He rejected the idea of a major waterway. The noise of the boat's motors would be too noticeable, and traveling by river would not provide the necessary isolation. He rejected the idea of using an old, abandoned runway, which would be too exposed to aerial surveillance, especially if the city folks came here with their thermal imaging cameras. They needed a place that combined the reliability of a bunker, the ability to work with electronics, and the height for stable data transmission. The purpose of the kidnapping, as Voron understood from Gromov's words, was not blackmail. Anna Svechina, a programmer, was working on a secret project. She was kidnapped to extract information from her, which was most likely protected by complex digital keys that only she had access to. Extracting information is a process. It is not a matter of an hour. It requires time, psychological pressure, and seclusion to rule out any interference or escape attempts. This place had to provide them with complete silence and a sense of control. Voron mentally reconstructed the psychological profile of the hostage. Anna Svechina, judging by her lonely, isolated life in a remote village, was a person who valued privacy and was probably deeply immersed in her work. In order to make her talk or work, the criminals needed to break her will using a highly controlled, sealed environment. This environment had to be the complete opposite of the open, unpredictable taiga. At the same time, they had to feel safe from pursuit. Height, Raven decided, his low, hoarse voice sounding like a verdict. Only height gives them the advantage of stable satellite communication, which is confirmed by the puck.
And only height allows them to avoid the humidity that is destructive to expensive electronics. He ran his finger across the map, bypassing the old logging road and moving upward.
There in the upper reaches, on a mountain pass, was the only facility that met all the requirements. An abandoned weather station. Weather stations were built to last. They were sturdy buildings, protected from wind and frost. Most importantly, the old radio antenna remained there, a relic of the past that could now serve as the perfect place to conceal their new digital equipment. The station was about 12 kilometers away in a straight line, but it was a steep climb for tired people carrying heavy loads. It was about 6 or 7 hours of exhausting travel. The kidnapping had taken place about a day ago. They must have gotten there the night before and were now inside. Voron felt the tension inside him give way to a cold, calculated confidence. He knew he was going to them. He knew that now their digital world, their perfectly planned operation, depended entirely on their physical fatigue and human need for rest and connection. They would rely on their cameras and sensors, on their gadgets to control the perimeter, but they would be tired. And tired people always make mistakes, the most gross and fatal ones. "Shadow, forward," Raven commanded briefly. Leica rose willingly, her eyes calm and attentive, looking up at the pass. They moved on, leaving behind the abandoned warehouse and its analog secrets. Now the path lay only upward, to the place where the digital crime was bound to fail. Inevitably. Raven knew that his strength lay not in understanding the logic of the program, but in understanding the logic of survival. And in the taiga, it is always the one who reads tracks better, not codes, who wins. The climb was long and relentless. Raven and Shadow made their way up an old geological route that was more of a hint of a road than a road itself. Every couple of steps up the steep slope required effort, but Raven felt no fatigue. His body, toughened by wind and exertion, had long since learned to switch to economy mode, where every muscle and every breath worked with mathematical precision, without unnecessary movements or emotions. He walked slowly but inexorably, like a glacier. He didn't need speed. He needed continuity. He knew that his opponents, who had climbed up here with heavy loads, must have stopped long ago and relied solely on statics, on waiting, on the illusion of security provided by the isolated, solid structure. They had climbed 500 meters, and the air had become noticeably drier and thinner, filled with the smell of stone and alpine herbs. Raven stopped on a small platform to examine his binoculars, wiping the lenses with the edge of his sleeve. At that very moment, the silence that enveloped them was broken by a low, pulsating hum, a sound that in these parts meant only one thing: interference. Voron raised his binoculars. A black dot appeared above the distant, fur-covered ridge and quickly grew larger. A helicopter. Large, civilian-colored, but with clear signs of special equipment on board. It was not local transport, not rescuers. It was the very
city folk that Gromov had warned about. The Moscow police, or the special services, to whom, as usual, the case had been handed over when it became too complicated, too secret, and beyond the competence of the district department. They used their strength, technology, and speed to cover the area, but in doing so, they completely ignored the ground. The helicopter moved slowly, scanning the area. Raven knew exactly what they were doing. Thermal imaging, possibly some kind of ground-penetrating radar, or scanning for radio signals. He considered these methods useless in the dense taiga, especially when the object they were looking for was inside a large building. Moreover, these methods were destructive. As the helicopter circled slowly, shaking the air and stirring up gusts of wind, Raven felt the natural balance around him being disrupted. A wild, almost animalistic rage rose within him. The sound of the propellers echoed through the gorge, scaring away birds, frightening small animals, and most importantly, destroying the invisible, subtle traces that might have remained in this part of the forest. The vibration of the ground, the noise, the wind flow, all of this erased smells, shifted small pebbles, and disturbed the natural position of moss and pine needles. They weren't just searching. They were destroying evidence without even realizing it. Voron took out the satellite phone he had hidden in his case and dialed Gromov. "You broke the agreement, Oleg." Voron's voice was even and low, but it rang with steel. "What's that iron bird overhead?" Gromov immediately began to justify himself, his voice fussy and pathetic. "Ivan Andreevich, it's not me. It's the feds. They sent it down from above, said it was a matter of national importance. They have new equipment. They can only destroy. Right now, they're sweeping away everything left on the ground with their wind and noise. They are looking for a person with the help of a machine they don't understand, in a place that is white noise to them. It's useless and dangerous." "But Raven, they brought in radio electronics experts. They're trying to determine where their station is based on background radiation. They are trying to find a digital needle in an analog haystack. If they wanted to find it, they would have found it by the tracks that led here. And now that they've stirred up this dust, they won't find anything but their own reflection in their screens," Raven said, like a teacher explaining basic truths to a careless student. He knew the argument was useless. City authorities and their experts would always rely on tools rather than instinct. They saw the taiga as an empty space to be filled with data, not a living system to be read. To Raven, their technology was yet another manifestation of human pride and blindness. "I'm cutting off communication. From now on, I'm working alone. Tell your guests from the capital that if they come within 2 kilometers of the pass, I will consider it interference with my work and will not be responsible for what happens to them." Voron cut off the conversation without even waiting for Gromov's response. He put his phone away. This was his final break with the city investigation. He was no longer a consultant. He had become Voron again, a bird of prey who worked according to his own laws, guided only by his internal code of honor and the laws of the wild. The helicopter seemed to sense his decision. It made another circle, its shadow gliding across the ground, and then, as if mocking him, flew toward the pass, along the route Raven had chosen for himself. It was a direct invasion. Raven felt his wind-beaten face tighten with contempt. He couldn't allow these amateurs, relying on technology, to destroy his trail, or worse, scare off the kidnappers, forcing them to make hasty, unpredictable decisions. He changed his route, leaving the open geological trail
and entering the thicket of cedar trees and dense undergrowth. It was harder to move, but he was completely hidden from view and from the cameras above. Now he relied not on speed, but on silence and knowledge of the terrain. He used his hands to carefully push the branches aside without breaking them or leaving any traces. The shadow followed him like his own shadow, its paws making no sound. The irony was bitter. In order to find high-tech criminals hiding from the digital world, Raven now had to hide from the rescuers and law enforcement officers, who themselves were bringing chaos to the tiger. To him, they were just another sick individual disrupting the balance of the ecosystem. He walked forward, feeling his determination grow. The more they relied on gadgets, the more Raven knew that his analog knowledge of how a living system works, would give him a decisive advantage. He had to get to the weather station before the city folks could do irreversible damage. The shadow of the helicopter, which Raven despised with his whole being, like the shadow of a predatory but blind bird, still glided over the distant ridges. But now its hum was no longer so insistent. The federal forces, encountering the difficulties of the terrain and finding no digital traces, had probably withdrawn to regroup or change tactics. But their presence had already done its damage. The ecosystem had been disrupted. The tremors and unnatural noise had swept away the last faint smells and traces that might have remained in open areas. The Raven was now not just a hunter, but also a restorer, forced to work with damaged material. He led the shadow through the most remote ravines, using his knowledge of local winds and mountain terrain to muffle the sound of his movements as much as possible and avoid detection. He deliberately avoided places where the helicopter had conducted its searches, knowing that any traces left there had been destroyed by air currents and vibrations. He headed north, toward a pass that was called Closed Circle Ridge on old maps. At this spot, at an altitude of almost 2,000 meters, among bare, wind-eroded rocks and dwarf pines, there was an abandoned weather station. He knew this place. Built in the middle of the last century to monitor atmospheric phenomena, it had everything criminals needed. First, complete isolation and an almost guaranteed absence of accidental witnesses. Second, a solid structure that protected from wind and cold. Third, and most importantly, an old but sturdy radio antenna and, undoubtedly, an emergency diesel generator. It was the perfect place for digital isolation and data transmission. Inaccessible to ordinary urban communications, but capable of working with powerful satellite equipment. It was the final destination for logistics. The kidnappers brought equipment that required power and a stable platform to operate. They weren't going to blackmail. They were going to extract information from Anna Svechina. And that required time and a reliable hideout. The higher they climbed, the more Raven felt a subtle but profound disturbance in the balance. The feeling was akin to mysticism, but in reality, it was a pure instinctive reaction to changes in a living system. In this forest, at this altitude, certain species of birds should have been present. High-altitude larks, several pairs of nuthatches, accustomed to the cedar dwarf pine. But Raven heard only emptiness. The birds that should have been feeding on the northern slope were absent. He stopped at the edge of a vast stone plateau, covered with icy boulders, and unfolded his binoculars. He wasn't looking for the station itself. Its silhouette was visible against the bright sky. He was looking for signs that its inhabitants had become part of this ecosystem. Instead of birdsong, he caught another, more disturbing sound. The shadow, which had always been an extension of his will, silently pointed its nose at a small patch of moss at the edge of the crevice. The raven knelt down. Here, in the shadow of the rock, lay a small but unnaturally large pile of high-altitude wagtail droppings. He examined it slowly and carefully, noting its size, consistency, and age.
Wagtails feed on insects, and at this time of year, their diet must be particularly meager. But this portion was abundant, suggesting that the bird had recently experienced severe stress, or, conversely, was unable to digest food normally.
The most important thing was something else. Wagtails, like most high-altitude birds, are incredibly territorial and sedentary. If something had not frightened it, it would not have left such a large amount of material in one place. It was frightened and returned, but could not calm down. He expanded his search area using binoculars, and then he noticed something that completely confirmed his guess about the disturbance. At the very edge of the dwarf pine forest, about 100 meters from the weather station, sat a large cedar nutcracker. The bird was completely motionless, its head twitching abnormally frequently. It didn't make a sound, even though it should have been busy collecting pine cones at that time. The crossbill was frozen with fear. The raven realized that the bird was at the limit of its instinctive fear. He mentally drew a line from the frozen crossbill to the weather station. It was an invisible boundary that the kidnappers had created around themselves. It could have been an area of excessive noise from the generator, an overly pungent smell, or, more likely, invisible but constant radiation from the operating satellite equipment. While the human operator, relying on his hearing and vision, noticed nothing. Living systems, birds, animals, all reacted to the unhealthy alien presence, avoiding it. It was proof that active, round-the-clock work was going on inside the station. The raven felt the tension that had built up over the past day finally come together in a single, sharp focus. He didn't need thermal imaging or radar. The forest itself showed him where to go, and most importantly, where the border he had to cross was. The fear of birds was his last and most reliable guide. It was the very analog error that Raven had been looking for. The digital world, having entered the taiga, was unable to mask its unnaturalness from its most sensitive inhabitants. He fastened his hunting knife to his belt, checking its position. From this moment on, he had to move not just cautiously, but like an invisible shadow, completely merging with the slow movement of the mountain air and light. The last 100 meters to the target, where the balance was disturbed, would be the most dangerous. He looked at Shadow, who raised her ears and turned her nose in the opposite direction from the weather station, checking the wind direction. The dog knew that soon she would have to work in complete silence, relying only on her instincts. Raven nodded to her, and the unspoken order was understood. They began to circle the plateau, using every rock and every shadow cast by the dwarf pines. The target was no longer just visible. It was palpable. The steel needle of the antenna, sticking out of the stone building like a thorn piercing the flesh of the tiger. The surroundings of the weather station on the closed circle ridge were an arena where two worlds collided. The world of Raven's pure, silent instinct, and the world of digital control, in which the kidnappers believed unquestioningly. The station, built of thick stone and covered with rusty sheets of tin, looked like an impregnable bunker. Raven used his main weapon, invisibility. He didn't just move quietly, he moved in sync with his surroundings, like part of a wind shadow.
like a slow change in light. His approach was not an attack, but a process of dissolving into the landscape. Raven knew that any security system, relying on technology, had blind spots and required power, which meant it left physical traces. The criminals were not people of the taiga. They were people who had brought their comfort and confidence with them, and that confidence was their main weakness. They relied on night vision cameras, motion sensors, satellite communications, but not on the fact that the earth itself, the stones themselves, and the wind could become the eyes and ears of the enemy. The shadow, following the tacit, almost telepathic orders of its master, moved just as he did. But its role was much more subtle. Raven used the dog as a biological sensor and as a tool to distract attention. He did not allow it to make a sound, but used its sense of smell to determine the exact location of people inside and outside the building. About 100 meters from the station, Raven discovered the first line of defense. A barely noticeable string, stretched 10 centimeters above the ground, camouflaged in dwarf shrubs. It was most likely a trigger for a light or sound alarm connected to a primitive sensor. The urban approach was to set a trap for a person walking upright and not looking at their feet. Voren, moving in a crouched, cat-like manner, did not even disturb the tangled branches. He stopped, hiding behind a large boulder warmed by the sun during the day, and began his acoustic reconnaissance. Slowly, with minimal effort, he moved a small stone weighing half a kilogram. The stone rolled down the rocky slope, making a dry, rustling sound that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the pass. Raven waited. He knew that the nerves of people driven into isolation must be on edge. A few seconds later, which Raven counted with perfect accuracy, using his internal metronome, a shadow flashed at the western corner of the building, where, according to his calculations, the generator was located. A guard. He came out holding a flashlight with a narrow, bright beam that cut through the darkness like glass. It was a city flashlight, giving off a lot of light, but completely blind to detail. Relying on his equipment, the guard scanned the slope with a beam, looking for large animals or people. He found nothing but rocks and shrubs, and, cursing irritably, disappeared inside. That moment was enough for Raven. He determined, first, there were 2 people, since the second one did not come out. Second, they relied on light and sound, which meant their hearing was dulled by the generator and possibly headphones. Third, they were tired. Their overly sharp and nervous reaction to such an insignificant sound suggested that they hadn't slept in a long time and were waiting for an attack. But they were waiting for it from the computer, not because of the rock. Raven took a small steel plate out of his backpack, which he had brought with him from home. He placed it in his palm and, calculating the trajectory, threw it in the opposite direction, beyond the eastern corner of the station. The sound of it hitting the old metal was louder than a falling stone, sharp, metallic, panicked. This time the reaction was different. Judging by the noise inside, both guards spoke excitedly, but only one came out. And this time he was much more tense, his movements sharp and clumsy. He did not come out completely, but peeked around the corner, scanning the ground with his flashlight. He was looking for what had hit the metal. At that moment, taking advantage of the distraction and his perfect silence, Raven sprinted. He did not move toward the building, but in an arc, bypassing it from the north, where the second acoustic signal had sounded. He used a strong gust of wind whistling between the rocks to mask the rare crunch of gravel under the soles of his well-worn boots. When the guard returned inside, Raven was already at the wall, where,
judging by the smell of diesel fuel and the sound. The generator was located. The generator was the true heart of their digital world.
Without power, their state-of-the-art equipment became dead weight, and they themselves became blind kittens.
Voron leaned against the cold stone, his breath as quiet as the movement of the air.
He could hear the generator humming inside the building, behind the thick wall, and that hum was the only thing preventing them from hearing him. He ran his hand along the wall, looking for an external route or cable outlet. The shadow, meanwhile, remained by the boulder, continuing to monitor the perimeter. But at this point, her actions were purely instinctive. Seeing that her master had entered the critical zone, the dog herself became part of his security system. She knew that any unexpected shadow or sound from the other side would require her intervention. Raven found what he was looking for. A rough cable stretched from the generator shed to the main building. The cable was secured with metal clamps to an old log that had once served as a support for a canopy. The criminals were professionals at digital camouflage, but amateurs at domestic engineering. They hadn't bothered to bury the cable or even protect it from mechanical damage. Raven took out his hunting knife. He wasn't going to cut the cable. That would trigger the emergency system and cause panic, which was not in his interest. He wasn't looking to destroy, but to paralyze. He found a weak spot, a connection covered with thick but poorly attached electrical tape. Using the tip of his knife, he began to carefully, millimeter by millimeter, peel away the tape to get to the wires. He worked by touch, his fingers, rough and sinewy, becoming the most precise tool. Voron knew he needed to create a temporary but complete short circuit that would cut off the power without causing a fire or an audible alarm, but simply cause the system to freeze. He chose a point on the thick main power wire, which he estimated led to the main input. When he touched the insulation with the steel tip of the knife, a loud, excited voice rang out inside the station. "You idiot! I told you to change the battery in the east chamber. Now it's not working." Raven froze. Chaos reigned inside, caused by a technical malfunction. And this malfunction turned out to be a better diversion than his pebbles. The digital system had developed its own uncontrollable crack. Raven, taking advantage of this momentary panic, carefully cut the insulation. He didn't need much. He just needed to set the stage for the final lightning-fast strike. He put down the knife and looked at the wall. Now that the generator was noisy and the guards were cursing at the equipment, it was his time. He was ready to infiltrate. Sudden, deafening silence. That's right. Not sound, but its complete absence signaled success. Raven used the tip of his old knife not as a weapon, but as a surgeon's tool, to achieve not destruction, but instant paralysis. One perfectly calculated movement, and the thin, barely noticeable metal plate he inserted into the cut in the insulation closed the circuit, cutting off power from the main generator. The sharp, unnatural noise that had previously torn through the air like a coarse canvas disappeared, leaving behind only a ringing in his ears and the absolute, primordial sound of the taiga. Inside the stone building, according to Voron's calculations, chaos reigned. He heard muffled, panicked screams and the crash of a falling chair. People whose vision and hearing depended on brightly lit screens, night vision cameras, and indicators suddenly found themselves in complete, impenetrable darkness. They lost control, not over the perimeter, but over their own sense of reality. It was precisely this psychological effect that Raven had counted on. Digital professionals
fear the night, silence, and technical failure far more than a direct attack. These three elements were his invisible allies.
The raven moved toward the only door, invisible and silent as flowing water. He did not rush, because he knew that any hasty movement in the dark would be interpreted by the guards as a threat, and they would open fire.
He waited until the initial animal panic gave way to a nervous but organized reaction. A few moments later, there was a dry click of the bolt, then another, an excited whispering. The guards, frightened by the darkness, took up defensive positions, but they were aiming into the void, toward the door, relying on their memory of the location of the doorway rather than on actual vision. At that moment, Raven struck. He didn't break down the door, too noisy. He used the knowledge he had gained from reading the tracks. The hinges of the old door were covered not with oil, but with dust and rust. When opened, they would make a heart-wrenching, creaking sound. Raven took a small, oiled rag out of his pocket, which he carried to clean his binoculars, and carefully pushed it into the gap above the top hinge with the tip of his knife. Then, using his incredible sinewy body, dried out by years of survival in the forest, he pressed the door with his shoulder, gently, without jerking, turning the handle and moving the heavy wood. There was no creak, only a dull hissing sound that was swallowed up by the silence. He entered a narrow corridor. Chaos reigned here. Chairs lay overturned on the floor, tables were pushed aside, and there was a smell of burnt plastic, apparently from a momentary power surge when the circuit closed. To his left, he heard muffled voices. Two security guards were trying to find spare flashlights by touch and fix the generator. They were busy, obsessed with restoring their digital control. It was perfect. Voron walked deeper into the station. The stone walls absorbed sound, and his movements were so refined that he didn't even disturb the centuries-old dust that had settled on the floor. He discovered the main workroom. It wasn't like the prison cell he had expected to see. It resembled an operating room. Only instead of surgical instruments, there were high-powered laptops, server units, and screens, now useless and black. Anna Svechina, a programmer, sat on an army folding chair in front of one of the black tables. She was not chained. She was held, not by physical violence, but by psychological pressure, fear for her life, and perhaps the oath she had sworn to the project. The light coming through the dirty single window illuminated her profile. She was pale but not broken. Her gaze, full of exhaustion, was fixed on the black screen, as if she still hoped to see some kind of symbol on it. When Raven entered, her head slowly turned. There was no scream in her eyes, no hysteria, only a momentary striking spark of realization. She understood who he was and why he was there long before his figure fully emerged from the shadows. She had that inner obsession with the truth that Raven had always respected. She knew that the kidnapping was not the end of the project, but its criminal, dirty continuation. He came up close to her and stopped. Not a single word. Every word in this situation would carry the weight of an accusation or a sentence. And Raven wasn't going to waste them. He wasn't looking at her, but at her hands, at the nervous twitching of her fingers, looking for a reaction. "Where?" he asked, in an almost soundless, guttural whisper. The question needed no explanation. She couldn't speak. There was another person in the room, their chief controller, who was apparently in charge of their communication with headquarters, and was now trying to revive the satellite phone in the corner. This man did not notice Voron, immersed in his technical panic,
cursing the lack of signal and power. Anna, without taking her eyes off Voron, nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the table. On the table lay a thick, laminated report, apparently instructions or a diagram that she had to study. She nudged the report with her trembling finger, barely noticeable. Voron leaned over the table. He did not pick up the report, so as not to leave fingerprints and waste precious time. He glanced at the lamination. It was a perfect, slippery surface, incapable of holding a speck of dust or a trace. But on this surface, in the corner of the sheet, drawn under the uneven light of the lantern, he noticed something. On the lamination itself, just above the line, critical node, location X, there was a barely discernible mark. It was not an ink mark. It was a very fine, barely noticeable scratch, as if made by a sharp but blunt object. For example, the corner of that very paperclip that had been used recently, or a broken fingernail. A mark that no thermal imager or digital camera would see, but which was visible to him, like the bed of a dry river on a map. It was an analog puncture, a clue to the location of critical, physically tangible data, but was not encrypted in memory. He understood. Raven knew his time was up. He nodded back at her. Her eyes reflected calmness, replacing the horror. She had shared her secret with him. Now her salvation was not only a matter of his honor, but also of restoring balance. He pointed her eyes to the dark corner behind the rack where the old bags used to be stored, not allowing himself any unnecessary movements. She understood, and without rushing, as if she were simply tired and decided to rest, slowly pushed her chair back. Raven turned around. Now his gaze was fixed on the person in the corner, who, finally sensing his presence, turned sharply, raising the satellite phone that had just come to life, trying to catch a signal. Metal flashed in the controller's hand. The final confrontation was inevitable. The noose of silence that Raven had thrown over the weather station worked perfectly. There was no noise or shouting, no gunshots that could attract the helicopter. There was only sudden, paralyzing darkness caused by the generator shutting down. The guards below, deprived of light and communication with the perimeter, panicked instantly, turning from professionals into frightened, helpless boys, whose world was built on digital displays. Their flashlights flashed like sick fireflies, but they only shone into the void. Raven knew that a person who lost their technical crutches also lost their confidence and logic. He let them burn through their adrenaline reserves, while he, silent as an autumn leaf, slipped out the side door, leaving behind the incapacitated but still living bodies. He wasn't looking to kill. He was looking to restore balance. The leader, a tall, thin man in his 40s, with a face like a wax mask, now illuminated only by the dim light of the flashlight on his forehead, which he held in his hands for show, stood in the center of the room where Anna Svechina had been working. Just a minute ago, the generator light went out so suddenly that the table was left littered with wires and half-loaded monitors, like a surgical table after a failed operation. Voron did not smell the tiger on this man, but rather the sharp, unfamiliar scent of expensive cologne and panic, which had already permeated his expensive but completely useless clothing. The man was holding a satellite phone in his hand, trying to find a signal, as if the device itself were his only chance of salvation. "Who's there? Come out. I'll give you money." "You don't understand who you're dealing with." The leader's voice was high-pitched, like the squeak of an ungreased cart. He tried to use the language of force, but his intonation betrayed the arrogance of a man
who believes that his problems can always be solved with other people's resources, not his own strength.
The raven emerged from the shadows, silently, as if he had grown out of the ground. His figure, wiry, in faded traveling clothes, with eyes that saw right through him, looked like an absolute, inexorable force of nature in the dim light. The leader flinched, not out of fear, but out of astonishment that something could move so silently and unnoticed. "You have broken the law," Raven said low and slow, each word falling into the silence like a lead weight. "What law? The law of the forest? Don't make me laugh, old man. There is the law of money and the law of power. Your poaching concepts don't work here."
I work for people who tomorrow can make you the director of your dam reserve, or wipe you off the face of the earth. The leader feverishly pressed the satellite phone to his ear, but it still couldn't find a connection.
He believed in digital salvation. Voron shook his head, his gaze unchanged, remaining heavy and calm. He saw before him not a criminal, but a sick individual, someone who, possessing excessive power and resources, used them to destroy the balance. Such people were worse than predators who killed out of necessity. These killed out of greed, and for the sake of abstract control over what did not belong to them. The law of nature. It says, what belongs to someone else must be returned to its owner. Raven took a step forward. "Stop." The leader tried to reach behind his belt for something that was supposed to be his last argument. Maybe it was a stun gun, maybe a compact pistol. But he was too fast in the city and too slow here. Instead of getting into a fight, Raven did what he did best. He confused him, depriving him of his last hope for communication. With a sharp, incredibly precise movement, without getting too close, Raven threw his left arm out to the side. In it, like an extension of his bone, flashed an old hunting knife. He didn't throw it. He simply hooked the tip of the blade onto the satellite phone. The blow was calculated not to damage, but to displace. The phone slipped from the leader's sweaty, weak fingers and fell with a dull thud into a puddle of fuel oil and rainwater that had accumulated near the broken window. It was not a physical blow, but a psychological one. Having lost contact, the leader lost his footing. His face, resembling a wax mask, completely lost its shape. He screamed, not from pain, but from the realization of absolute isolation, from the fact that his digital world had collapsed and the analog world was alien and hostile to him. He rushed to the side, trying to get around Voron and run to the stairs, but the tiger would not let him go. Voron knew that fear makes a person run in a straight line, ignoring obstacles. The raven's next move was not an attack, but a restraint technique. Using his body weight and knowledge of leverage, he intercepted the leader as he tried to slip past and threw him to the floor, which was rotten and slippery from years of dampness and dust. The fall was hard, knocking the wind and all the city's self-confidence out of him. The leader gasped, his lantern flew off and rolled into the darkness. Raven stood over him. He felt neither anger nor triumph, only a quiet, cold satisfaction. For him, justice was not revenge, but the restoration of order that had been disrupted. A man who destroys balance must be removed. He pressed his knee heavily on the leader's back, preventing him from getting up. The law of power does not work here, under the sky. Here, the law of honor works. "You violated it," Raven said, looking not at him, but into the darkness.
where the quiet, almost ghostly squeak of a satellite phone dying in a pool of fuel oil could be heard.
It was a symbol of everything he hated. Perfect plans ruined by human greed and technology that couldn't protect its owners from themselves. The confrontation ended not with a bullet, but with a simple, dirty fall that revealed the fragility of his opponent. Voron pulled a rope out of his belt bag. All he had to do now was wait for Gromov's helicopter to stop circling in the sky, destroying the traces, and finally get down to its direct duty. The heavy, ragged sound of helicopter blades, which Voron despised so much, finally broke through the thick clouds like a giant iron mosquito drawn by the scent of someone else's misfortune. Voron waited for it at the entrance to the weather station, putting away the rope and knife, not allowing himself the slightest movement that could be perceived as fussiness. He was not obliged to wait, but it was part of the deal with Gromov, to return the sick individuals to the world that had created them. Anna Svechina, pale but alive, sat inside, wrapped in an old blanket, staring out the window with an empty, incredulous gaze. She had been saved, but the secret they had tried to extract from her remained, like a burn mark that could not be erased. Gromov was the first to jump out of the helicopter, followed by a group of people in clean, untouched taiga camouflage suits, with brand-new equipment that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of old, rusty structures. It was their shoes that caught Voron's attention. The boots were clean, expensive, with traces of factory grease. They seemed to have never known dirt, moisture, or uneven moss. They stepped on the ground as if on asphalt, their steps loud and confident, but not rooted in this soil. They brought with them not so much justice as protocol, loud and meaningless in this silence. Gromov ran up to Voron, his face a mixture of relief and formal irritation. "Ivan Andreevich, you're crazy. Why didn't you get in touch?" "I've been waiting for 3 hours," Gromov began, but Voron raised his hand, interrupting the flow of words as if turning off a valve. "They're all there, tied up. The hostage is upstairs. She's not physically injured. You need a generator to power up your digital world. There's still oil in the tank, but start it carefully and don't waste it," Voron said, looking away at the tops of the pine trees, as if he were reporting not to the captain, but to the forest. He didn't mention the backup Anna Svechina had left behind, or the data she had managed to save. This information was too important and too fragile to be handed over to people who thought first and foremost about reports. Gromov, accustomed to his manner, just waved his hand, signaling to the 2 officers to get back to the station. He tried again. What about their motives? What were they looking for? Who is this leader? He's not saying a word. He upset the balance, that's enough. His motive is greed, which has become a disease. I took them out. Now it's your job. I'm done. Raven took a step back. Wait. We have to file. Give testimony. This isn't just poaching, it's... This is the forest, and I'm not your witness. I'm here to restore order. I'm leaving. Raven nodded toward Shadow, who was sitting 10 paces away, her golden eyes fixed on her master. His farewell was terse and full of unspoken contempt. He did not wait for the city folk to begin their theater, photographing the tracks, setting up their equipment, destroying the very essence of the place with their presence. He simply turned and left, his figure instantly dissolving into the shadows of the forest, as if he had never been there. Behind him remained the noise, bustle, shouts, and triumph of those who believed that victory lies in the number of protocols. Voron believed that victory lay in the silence after the storm. For Raven, the way back was not just a return, but a process of purification. Every mile he covered,
Every breath of pine-scented air washed away the sticky residue of someone else's crime, someone else's greed, and someone else's lies. The shadow walked ahead, its movements smooth, confident, without the slightest tension. They were returning to their own laws. Raven thought of the woman, Anna Shvetyina, and her fragile, almost mystical power that allowed her to leave a clue invisible to the eye, but obvious to a sensitive mind. She, too, had to break the digital order to save herself. He realized that the conflict was not between people, but between principles, between the chaos created by greed and the order that preserves fidelity to one's roots. When they reached the clearing where the drone had taken the programmer, the sun was already at its zenith, spilling gold onto the green moss. This was the very place where the invasion of digital evil into his world had begun, marked by a perfectly straight, thin strip. The strip, which he had measured and read, was still visible, like a seam on the body of a living organism. It was a perfect trace, bearing no human error, but pointing to the place where man had made that mistake. The Raven stopped. He knelt at the edge of the strip, and the shadow, realizing that this was the end of the journey and the beginning of rest, lay down beside him. He took off his glove, and his sinewy, weather-beaten fingers touched the moss. Soft, damp, alive. He could not erase the memory of what had happened here, but he could erase the trace itself, the wound itself. Slowly, carefully, he began to loosen the moss, gently shifting the fibers, lifting the flattened stems, and returning them to their natural, disorderly position. He worked like an artist, erasing a mistake, or a surgeon suturing an incision. It was his own quiet ritual. He erased the perfect strip created by the machine, restoring the natural, chaotic pattern of nature. He wasn't just covering up evidence. He was returning the taiga to its original, untouched balance. The machine could not leave mistakes, but the man who relied on it left a puncture, first in the form of fatigue, then in the form of greed, and then in the form of panic. And Raven, following this analog puncture, restored the balance. When he was done, all that remained of the perfect, even line was a slightly flattened but now living surface of moss, which in a few days would completely hide any signs of interference. He got up, put on his glove, and looked south, where this business had come from. There remained the noise, the money, and the people who believed they could control the world through wires. Raven turned north, toward the wild, untouched taiga, toward his home, where the laws were harsh but fair. He had done what he had to do. His justice was not served in court, but on the ground, under the sky, where truth always leaves its mark. He walked away, leaving only silence behind him. A quiet, conscious sadness about how easily order is broken and how difficult it is to restore it.